If you're anything like me, you're probably eager to get your hands in the dirt, get something planted, but you're taking one look outside, it's cold, snowy, the grounds are frozen, and you're probably telling yourself there's no way I can get anything started for a while. But I'm here to tell you that that's not the case, and in today's video, we're going to be going over 8 crops that you can start from seed indoors for large, healthy transplants come spring. So before we actually move on to what we're going to be planting, we need to first talk about timing. All of the plants that we're going to be starting today take a long time to grow at the beginning of their life cycle. Not only do they take 2+ weeks just to germinate, but after they sprout, they tend to put all of their energy into their roots, and not so much their top growth. So because of this, they'll just be sitting on your shelf, look like they're not growing that much, when really all of that growth is happening underground where the roots are. Now, after the plants have time to establish their root systems, things really do start to take off. The plants start getting much bigger, but this process takes time, and for this reason, all of the plants that we're going to be starting today benefit from 10, 12, even 14 weeks indoors if you can give it to them. Now, I'm not saying that you can't plant these seeds later on, but let's say you had a 4 to 6 week old plant. If you try to plant that outside, a lot of times it's just going to sit in your garden, it's going to take up space, and not really do much for a month to possibly even 2 months. And it really becomes problematic, especially for climates that have less growing days. Another thing is that if you try to plant younger, smaller plants outdoors, and they're not really established, a lot of times they're going to suffer transplant shock, which kind of just shuts the plant down altogether, adding more days onto when you'll actually be able to get your harvest. To whereas if you're planting a plant that's larger, more established, it can kind of cope with that transition period and really bounce back much quicker than it would if you're planting a younger, smaller plant. The whole point to starting these plants indoors this early is to really bypass this slow-moving process. And also so it doesn't take up half or even all of your growing season, and that when we go to actually plant outdoors, they're going to take off right away. They're going to thrive, they're going to get big, and they're not just going to sit there. Now again, when you should start these types of plants indoors does differ depending on where you live and what type of climate you're in. But if you go by the simple rule of starting them indoors 12 to 14 weeks before your average last frost date, you'll be fine. And if you don't know when your average last frost date is, I'll leave a link in the description below to where you can find it. Alright, now that we have all of that back info out of the way, it's time to start planting. But before we do so, please go ahead and like this video, subscribe, and don't forget to click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future videos. Alright, so one of the first and earliest crops that you want to get started from seed indoors are onions and leeks. Now, both of these can be planted literally the exact same way. They're both grown the exact same way. And the important thing with these is they take a long time to get established. Again, with the roots. Because onions especially it's all about the bulb, you really want to make sure that you have established healthy roots, large roots, for when you go and move them outside. So onions and leeks, definitely you want to get them started 12 to 14 weeks if you can. And so yeah, that's what we're going to do right now. Okay, so what I like to do with my onion seeds and a lot of the other crops that we're going to be starting today is a method called overseeding or multi-sowing. And basically what this method is planting more than 1 or 2 seeds per cell. So instead of planting 1 or 2, I actually do anywhere from 5 to 10 seeds per cell. And what this does is it allows you to save on space. So when you go to plant these outside, instead of having 50 different pots of onion seeds, and you have to individually plant all those, and have the space inside for them, and have the time to individually pot all of those up, just plant 5 to 10 seeds, have 5 to 10 seeds in one pot, and then what you can do when you come to plant them, or when it comes time to plant them, is gently tear those seedlings apart, and you can plant those one by one. Onion seeds are pretty indestructible, so you don't have to worry too much about damaging the seedlings when you are going to tear them apart and plant them. So when you are planting these, after you get done, you want to press them down, about 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch deep. You don't have to worry too much about this. If you go too deep, onion seeds will do everything they can to sprout. So if you go deeper than 1/2 an inch, don't worry about it. They will sprout. But the general depth that you want to try to aim for is around 1/4 to 1/2 an inch. And then after you plant them, just with your finger, cover them up. You can get some more soil, put on top of it, and yeah, you're good to go. They're literally as easy as that. Onion seeds will generally sprout in about a week. So once they sprout, you want to give them that 10, 12, 14 weeks indoors to really get their roots established. But because we're starting in these smaller cells, you want to pot these up once they get to a certain size. So once you see the roots starting to, curl at the bottom of the cells, that's when you really want to pot them up into a larger pot. I'm growing a ton of plants, so I have to start them in smaller cells. But if you're somebody that just plants just a few plants or, one tray, you can start them in the larger cells, which does make it easier so that you don't have to continuously pot up. But for people like me that have so many plants, that's why I'm starting in these smaller cells. After you get your seeds planted, always make sure to label whatever you started. I can tell you from experience that I would start, hundreds of seeds. Sometimes I would get lazy, I wouldn't label things, and then a couple weeks would go on, and then I would completely forget what I started. And it gets super annoying because then, especially if you're selling plants or if you have a certain variety that you really like and you can't remember what the name is, it can get irritating. So always write down, always list what you're starting on a piece of paper. You can do plant labels, you can do sticky paper, just something that will allow you to remember what you started. So here I'm just labeling onion or the vegetable or plant that you're starting, and then whatever variety it is. So like, for example, I'm doing 3 different varieties of onions. So labeling them individually based on their variety name is super helpful. Otherwise, all onion seeds look the same, all onion plants look the same. So until they start bulbing out, you really don't know what is what. Alright, now that we have the onion seeds planted, we're going to move on to our next crop that we're going to be starting today, and that's lavender. Now lavender is a Mediterranean herb. What this means is that it does not like super wet, soggy soil. So when you're planting these, you want to make sure that the soil is moist but not overly wet or soggy. If your soil is too wet or soggy, most of the time your seedlings are going to rot. They're going to suffer root rot. I've had so many plants, both with lavender and rosemary, that just die off because it gets too wet. These have to be treated differently than a lot of your other plants. So when you're putting the seeds in, again, we're going to overseed them, because one thing about lavender is the germination rates are extremely low, like super low. So you want to plant a lot more seeds than you usually would. Germination rates can they could be as low as 30%. So meaning if you planted 10 seeds, less than 5 of those are actually going to probably sprout. Unless you have really pure seeds and luck, you're probably going to have a pretty low germination rate. So you want to make sure that you plant a lot more, because if you only plant 1 or 2 seeds in each cell and neither of those germinate, then you're just wasting time, space again, like we talked about with the onions, but kind of for a different reason. But yeah, so you want to make sure you overseed it so you at least have 1 or 2 that sprout in each cell. I usually put around 4 to 6 seeds in each cell, and that usually does the trick. One other thing about lavender is that not only are the germination rates sporadic, but the time that it takes for these seeds to actually sprout or germinate can take a while. I mean, sometimes you'll be waiting 2, 3, 4, possibly over a month just to start seeing these sprout. So you really do want to be patient. One thing that you can do with lavender is go through a process called stratification. And basically what that is just putting your seed packets in the fridge for a certain amount of time to break an enzyme in the seeds that actually allows better germination rates and that allows more seeds to sprout. If you're interested in that process, we have a blog up on our website that you can check out that goes into further detail on how that works. But you can use that process before to improve germination results. So after you get these down, again, kind of with the onions, you just want to gently move these into the soil. Probably less than 1/4 of an inch. You don't want these too deep. You want it to be as easy as possible for these seeds to sprout because they're so hard in general to get going at the start. So you want to make sure that they have the best chances possible. And with that, so you just want to make sure that you're not planting them too deep. And then just lightly cover, and then you're good with the lavender. So the next crop that we're going to be planting today is rosemary. Now, rosemary is exactly like lavender when it comes to planting. Both the seeds look exactly the same, and when you're planting, you're going to do all of the same things with rosemary that you would lavender. So once you place the seeds, make sure you place more than 1 or 2 seeds because rosemary does have a little bit higher germination rates than lavender on average, but you still want to make sure that you place more seeds in each cell to make up for those seeds that don't sprout, and to make sure that you're actually having seeds that sprout and that don't sprout, and then you just have empty cells that are just taking up space. Again, when planting your rosemary seeds, just lightly sow. Don't plant too deep. Just gently brush them into the top 1/4 inch or less of your soil. That way they're just barely covered and that they can send out their roots, but not so deep to where they can't sprout. The other thing with these, just like lavender, do not overwater. Rosemary is a bigger pain than lavender when it comes to water issues. If you overwater one time, a lot of your seedlings are going to either get stunted or they're going to start rotting from the roots up. I've had so many rosemary plants. Rosemary is one that's been kind of difficult for me because they don't like how wet and moist the indoor environment is. It's better to have dry soil than it is to have wet soil. You may think that if your soil is super dry with these 2 types of herbs, your plants are going to suffer because they're not getting enough water. But both lavender and rosemary are used to living in desert climates, so they don't use a lot of water. So if you give them too much, they're going to suffer. One way you can prevent this is just allowing your soil to dry. Once you dig down and you see about the first 1/2 inch of your soil dry, you can water again. But if your soil is still wet on the top 1/2 inch, don't water again until that top 1/2 inch dries out completely. Trust me, it's going to save you a lot of pain, a lot of headache, and it's a process that I've used that I think really does help. All right, the next thing that we're going to be starting from seed today are peppermint and spearmint. Now, both of these are part of the mint family, and although they're super easy to grow and maintain once they get outdoors, they're not so fun to get going inside from seed. So there is a process to doing this, but most of the time people like to do them from propagation or from cuttings, which is basically just cutting a branch or a stem off of an existing plant, rooting that out because they root out super easily, and then planting that plant. That is the easiest way to do it, but if you're just starting out and you want to save some money, then growing from seed is the way to do that. When planting mint, you want to just barely sow these seeds. When I pour these out, you can see, I don't even know if you could see those. Those are so tiny that if you plant these too deep, they're not going to sprout. I mean, there's probably a couple hundred seeds in my hand just right there. So again, you want to overseed these. Something with mint is that when you're overseeding them, you can actually tear the root ball in half and get 2 plants. So with these, you do not want to just plant 1 or 2 seeds in one cell because, I mean, 1, it would be harder to do that because of how tiny these are. But 2, because you actually want a thick plant full of quite a few individual plants, not just 1. So when you're doing this, planting, I mean, you can do anywhere from 10 to 20 seeds in a cell and you'll be fine. Once these get established, once you get that root ball, like I said, you can tear them apart. You can tear that root ball into 2, 3, even 4 separate plants, as long as you have a slight amount of roots on your plant. That way you can literally get 4 plants per cell. So if you have 5 cells that you're starting, you can do 20 plants and you can fit them into 5 cells. So it's kind of with the onions, but that's just another process that you can use. So again, after we get these planted, just barely rub the soil. It's okay if they don't even get underneath the soil or if they don't get buried. It's probably actually better to keep them above the soil than it is below. Because of how tiny these are, it's almost impossible for them to actually push up if you plant them too deep. Mint is one of those plants that does take some time to get established, to get growing from seed, but once it does, it just flips a switch and it takes off like crazy. At times it feels like it grows almost an inch a day. You'll come back to your seeds, or you'll come back to your seedlings, and you'll just see completely new plants every day because they're growing so much. For this reason, you don't necessarily have to start them 10, 12, 14 weeks indoors. It's recommended so that you have large healthy transplants, but because mint grows so fast, you don't need to start it this late. It's just always what I've done for the best success. You can always, if they get too big, cut the plants or snip the stem and then root it out again, and then you should be fine. But because mint is so easy to grow once it gets established, you can stick a root-bounded plant in the ground and you'll be totally fine. It propagates so easily, and I think that's one of the main reasons that makes mint so fun to grow, for me at least. You do want to make sure to start your mint seeds early enough to where you break this slow cycle. Because these seeds are so tiny, if you just directly sow these outside, a lot of times they're not going to do anything, just because either weeds or other garden plants or things in the soil will disturb these seeds because they're so tiny. So you want to make sure that you have at least sizable plants, 6-inch tall plants, somewhere around that, so that you give it a much better chance of survival. But once your plants get established, like I talked about, and outdoors, you'll never have to do it again. It's a perennial, so it comes back every year in most places, and it's one of the easiest plants to take care of, in my opinion, just because of how easy it propagates, how easy it grows, and how easy it is to take care of. All right, we just got spearmint planted. The next one that we already talked about was peppermint. Again, grown the exact same way as spearmint. Both of these have the same growing requirements, same growing conditions. Peppermint takes typically a little bit longer than spearmint to get established and get going. So peppermint is one that you can start, 12 to 14 weeks and be fine. Whereas spearmint, I recommend 10 to 12 weeks, just kind of the time frame for both of these. Another tip that you can use for both peppermint and spearmint is using a spray bottle for watering. During germination, because the seeds are so tiny and you're not, sowing the seeds too deep, they're kind of just hanging on the top of the soil, and because of that, they can dry out really easily. So in order to not overwater or have to keep coming back and watering every time, just keep a spray bottle by wherever you're starting your seeds or wherever your seeds are at during germination. That way you can just slightly mist the top of your soil and keep them wet and moist until they start sprouting. You want to do this because water is important. It's one of the main things that you need to signal the seeds to sprout. So if you don't have water or they keep drying out, the soil keeps drying out, you're going to have either sporadic germination or no germination at all, which can become an issue and is something none of us want. So keep a spray bottle by your seeds. That way you can avoid this problem. All right, next up to grow is thyme. Thyme is one of my absolute favorite herbs to start because of how easy they are to grow. They do so well starting from seed. They do so well in indoors in general. So it's just something that I like to grow every year because it doesn't take too much effort to get them started and get them outdoors. No matter how you plant them, no matter what you do, they don't need a lot of nutrition. They don't need the fertilizer, and they just don't need that much to thrive and be healthy. So it's one of those herbs that I just really enjoy growing. So again, thyme has very tiny seeds. It does take time, just like no pun intended, but it does take some time to get these started, just like mint and all these other herbs. They go through that same slow process. So when we're starting them, again, multi-sowing or putting more seeds in each one, then you can split apart that root ball and it just becomes easier. So same process. These you can bury a little deeper than the mint seeds. Just slightly scratch the soil, just barely any soil above them, so that they can at least set their roots. But yeah, pretty straightforward. I mean, just planting them, pressing them down in the soil, covering them, and then it's that easy. Thyme is an herb that you really don't have to worry about when it comes to germination. Most seeds are going to sprout, so it's not something you need to put too much focus into. Germination rates are around 80 to 90% with this plant, so they're really easy to get sprouted. The only thing with them is that they can take a while to actually sprout, so anywhere from 14 days to a month is typical for actually starting to see baby plants come up. So just be patient with them, but they will come up eventually as long as you have healthy, viable seeds. All right, now the next thing that we're going to start is celery. Now celery, just like onions, is a vegetable that takes a very long time to start and grow. One thing I've noticed about celery is that it's not a very common thing to grow in the gardening community. I haven't seen a lot of advice and a lot of growing tips out there when it comes to growing this specific type of vegetable. So I may do a video in the near future about like a complete how-to starting guide, all about growing and maintaining your celery from seed to harvest. So if you're interested in that, make sure to subscribe so that you don't miss out on that possible video coming out soon. So when you're starting celery, like I said, it takes a very long time to grow. Because celery takes so long to actually get a harvest, 100 to 120 days on average, most people would rather just go to the grocery store, buy celery, than go through this whole long, drawn-out process. And although I do understand that, if you haven't tried growing celery before, it's a lot of fun to do, and I highly recommend it. Another thing is that all of the varieties that you can grow from seed, I mean, there's so many. There's pink celery, white celery, just a lot of fun things that you can try that you could only get when you're growing from seed. So when planting celery, it's pretty straightforward, just like the other seeds, just dropping them in. You don't have to overseed these. I'm just gonna because I have a lot of seeds, but it's not necessary. When these come up, you're going to see not a lot of growth. Since we are sowing multiple seeds per cell, once they all start germinating and coming up, you want to make sure to thin out the seedlings that you don't need. So if you have 5 seeds that come up in a cell, make sure to take out 4 of those so that you only have 1 remaining in each cell. If you have too many coming up, a lot of times they're all going to fight for the nutrition and just not do as good as they would if you had 1 per cell. They're not like the other herbs and veggies that we're starting today. They really do benefit from just having 1 instead of a bunch in the same cell. Again, after you place your seeds, make sure that you bury them about 1/4 of an inch deep. The seeds are pretty small, so you don't want them too deep, but you also don't want them at the top of the soil to where they're not buried at all. After you do that, just cover them with a super light layer of soil, and then you're good to go. And that's all you need to know for planting the celery. Alright, the last plant that we're going to be starting in today's video is oregano. Now oregano is one of those plants that it doesn't technically need 12 to 14 weeks indoors. It doesn't need that much time, but it does benefit from it. Oregano grows really fast. It goes through that same slow process as the other plants do, but it typically doesn't last as long, and it does tend to take off faster than your other plants would. So for this reason, you really can start oregano indoors 8 to 10 weeks, 10 to 12 weeks if you wanted to, but giving it that extra few weeks indoors can not only make your plants bigger, but it's going to give you a harvest way earlier in the season. And because oregano, every time you cut it, continues to grow back, it'll continue to give you a great harvest throughout the season. So that's why I like to plant mine indoors this early. So oregano is probably the tiniest seed there is, this and mint seeds. So again, there's no way that you can just plant 1 seed in. So it's another great one to overseed. So when we're overseeding, you're just placing, I'm probably placing as many as 15 seeds in each one. And then when they come time to pot up into your next container, you can again split that root ball and then have multiple plants in the same cell. And then again, once your seeds are placed, just like the other seeds, just lightly sow. These are really tiny, so you don't need to really bury them. Just lightly cover to where they just have a tiny bit of soil attached to them to where their roots can hold on and then start growing. One last thing I'll go over while I'm finishing up planting these seeds is using a heat mat. Now a lot of people use a heat mat, and it is a great option for improving germination and speeding up sprouting, and it's something that you can definitely use. I will say though, if you do decide to use it, make sure that you leave the heat mat plugged in the entire time while your seeds are trying to sprout. If you set it up to like a timer with your grow lights or other things, you're going to get sporadic germination results because your temperature is going to fluctuate between when your heat mat is on and when it's off. So just until germination, keep your heat mat on to really just keep your seeds at the same temperature the whole time. Once your seeds do germinate, make sure to turn your heat mat off. I know a lot of people will continue to keep their heat mat on while their plants are growing because they think the more heat they get, the more the plants are going to thrive. And this is just not the case. Your plants will actually end up getting leggy, they'll grow super fast, they'll fall over, they'll break, they'll die, and it's just not a good thing. So as soon as your plants germinate, make sure you get the heat mat away from them, turn it off. They don't need that heat anymore. Too much heat can cause all these issues, and plants all of these plants that we're starting really do thrive in anywhere from 65 to 75 degrees indoor. using heat mat will boost that temperature up to 80 degrees or 90 degrees, and it's just not healthy for the growth of the plants. One thing that I did want to mention a little bit more with the soil is that choose a soil that is light and fluffy. We have a video on this that we just did, so I highly recommend going and checking that out before you start planting your seeds. But you want something that is light and fluffy. Most bags that are meant for seeds say seed starting mix on it. You can also make your own, which we talked about in that video. But you just want something that has a consistency that seeds can break through, that they can germinate, root out well in, and just overall have a good chance of survival in. When you are placing your dirt or your soil medium in these cells, make sure that it is hydrated well, that you've already added water to it, because if you put dry mix in here, put your seeds in, and then try to water it, the water will sit on top. It floods over. It becomes a huge hassle, big pain. It's no fun. So make sure that it's hydrated before so that you don't have to deal with these issues. And then once you place your soil in here, make sure that it's pressed down and that it's compressed a little bit. That way it's not all airy inside and you're not only filling up half the cell, which can happen really easily with this type of medium. So just make sure that you're pressing down on your soil and that you bypass, these simple issues that can occur. And that's it when it comes to knowing which plants that you're going to want to start first this season and how to plant them perfectly from seed indoors. For a quick recap, these plants are onions, lavender, rosemary, thyme, peppermint, spearmint, oregano, and celery. Again, all of the plants that we started today, you want to get them planted anywhere from 10 to 14 weeks, if you can, indoors before you decide to go plant them in your garden. We do this because all of these plants go through what we call a slow period, or a very time-consuming point in their life that takes them quite a while to actually get established. You don't want to plant them when they're too young outside, otherwise a lot of times they'll have a harder chance of survival against the elements and all of the other natural things that can occur outside. So starting them in a controlled environment for a longer period of time can really set them up for better success outside. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up, and if you have any questions at all, make sure to leave those in the comment section below. And as always, please subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on any of our future content coming soon. Be sure to check out our blog and our seed shop on our website for a lot more helpful info and for some awesome seed varieties that you can get planting on your own. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.